Bob here. Bob volunteered a couple weeks ago to present this briefing. He had no idea that he would get this kind of interest. Fortunately, Bob's comfortable with public speaking. Let's see. I'll ask that you hold questions till the end. There's a lot of folks here, and if we start asking a lot of questions throughout the briefing, it can really bog us down. A little bit on Bob's background. He's been with MITRE for 2 years. He's been supporting the Army CIO office. Prior to coming to MITRE, Bob was with the State Department for 20 years and held assignments in Iran, Thailand, Austria, and Argentina. Bob's experience with Afghanistan was actually in the Peace Corps before he joined the State Department. With that, let me turn it over to Bob.
Thank you. My last overseas assignment, just to add to that list, was in Belgrade, Serbia. I spent 3 years there during the war in Bosnia. So I've been to a lot of garden spots in my career. Well, you're beginning to know more and more about Afghanistan. You're reading about it in the newspapers. I'm going to go over some issues fairly quickly and get to the other areas which I think will be new news for you. Afghanistan is a country about the size of Texas in South Asia. It's landlocked. You've got a long border with Pakistan to the south, Iran to the west, a little bit of China to the east. You have this little corridor of land here. When you talk about buffer states, this is the archetypical buffer state. This little piece was added on to create a buffer between Russia and the British Empire. And these former Soviet republics of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan form the northern border, but along the border is the Oxus River that travels right along here and forms the northern boundary. Over here on the Iranian side, it's mostly desert. Down here, it tends to be mountainous valleys. Here is the famous Khyber Pass right here. And this is the traditional gateway to get into Afghanistan. There are very, very few roads in and out of this country. In the north, there is Termez in Uzbekistan, which has a rail line. This is where the Russians entered the country. They built a bridge, the only bridge across the river to get into the northern part of Afghanistan. There's a huge mountain range that runs east and west across the country. It's called the Hindu Kush, and Kush means kill. So this is a place that traditional armies coming north would stop because the high mountains, 12,000 to 20,000 feet high. The Russians built a road back in the early 60s from their territory to Kabul, which is right here, over the Hindu Kush Mountains. It's an engineering masterpiece. It's the highest pass in the world. The road goes over 12,000 feet high. Unfortunately, because it goes over the mountains, it's also very easy to interdict. And in fact, it's just as bad as coming from the south up through the Khyber Pass. The Khyber Pass, as I said, is where the British traditionally tried to enter the country. And it's a very foreboding place. The pass is about 30, 40 miles long. It narrows down to 15 to 20 feet wide in places. Steep cliffs, 600 to 1,000 feet high on either side. And it goes on for mile after mile after mile. It's a very foreboding place. Any little place where it's level ground is full of dragon teeth, concrete dragon teeth, and the hills have forts on it all along the whole length. But what makes it really creepy when you go through there is the number of monuments that you come across. Here was the last stand of the British 54th Regiment. There was the last stand of the British Sapper Division or whatever. They had so many military disasters through this area, which we'll go into in a little bit of detail, that at times in history you would crunch on the bones of the soldiers as you walk through the pass. So it's not any place that you'd want an army to go through if you had a choice. The easiest entranceway to the country would be, if we could, would be through Iran. It's pretty flat through here to Kandahar, which is here. This is where Mullah Omar has his headquarters, up to Ghazni, to Kabul. This is a fairly flat area here, but really can only get there from this way. There's another entrance down here at Quetta, which is in Pakistan, going up through some pretty rough territory, but probably a little bit better than going through the Khyber Pass. And Kandahar is an area of interest to us at this point in time. Enough of the geography. The country is ethnically, linguistically, and tribally divided into a surprising number of entities for such a small country. The major groups are the Pashtuns, which are about 38%. The Tajiks and Uzbeks together, that's about 30%. And Hazara, which is about 20%. Now, I'll talk a little bit about those groups. The Pashtuns, who are the major component of the Taliban, are in the southern and western regions of the country, right in here. Now, I will say that this Pashtun area extends far into the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. So this area here is all Pashtun-speaking area. The Tajiks, the Uzbeks are up here in the northern part of the country where you'd expect them to be. Hazara, which are a Mughal tribe, in the central part of the country. Persian speaking over in this part of the country. But the Taliban gathers most of its strength and its support from this tribal Pashtun area here. These Pashtuns are an Aryan tribe, as I said. About 30% of Pakistan falls into this area. The rest are, when you think of Pakistanis, they're like Indians, they're Dravidians, smaller, dark, slender people. The Pashtuns tend to be whiter skinned, tall, bearded, just completely different. Apples and oranges from the rest of Pakistan.
Where did you live again?
Kabul, which is the capital right there. This tribal area, I want to point out, has never been under the control of the central government of Pakistan or the British before them or the government. When you travel from Peshawar up towards the Khyber Pass, you pass a sign that says, "Warning, pass this spot, travel at your own risk. Government writ does not go past this place." This is all tribal area in here. So when you hear about people saying they're going to close the border, that's really a joke. What they mean is they're going to close the few recognizable passes that they control, and all the rest of it is still wide open for anybody and anything to go back and forth. People speak Dari, which is an older variant of Persian. They're mutually intelligible. People who speak Persian can speak Dari and understand it. They just have a funny accent, like English and Scottish, I would say, thereabouts. The Pathans, the Pashtus, speak a different language called Pashtu. And then there's about 70 other languages spoken in this area. And I think probably the reason for that is that this has been at the crossroads of the world. This is part of the old Silk Route between China and the West. The caravans used to come through this area, down through this area, and out that way. So it's also seen a lot of invasions. First one that we know about is Alexander the Great in about 375 BC, traveled through this area and left little traces of his civilization here. You can still see some ruins of Greek temples, and I've got some slides here which can show you maybe before and after what the people live like now as compared to 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So you've had the Mughals. Genghis Khan came through here, left some people here. You had the Persians coming the other way, and you had Turkoman tribes also through this area. So it's a very mixed area. The population is entirely Muslim. The religion is woven deeply into the fabric of life and governs all aspects of day-to-day living. This is, I think, hard for us to understand, that we tend to put religion in a box and go to church on Sunday, at least a lot of us do, and we have a secular life and we have a religious life. But in Afghanistan, religion is the central core of life. Their view of Islam is, and its precepts for how you conduct yourself are absolutely central to their existence and cannot be separated from their day-to-day life in any way, shape, or form. There's no leftover colonial institutions or infrastructure in Afghanistan as there was in India or most places on the earth, most of Africa even. You had institutions of law, roads, courts, parliaments, artifacts left over from some colonial period. None of that exists in Afghanistan. When I was there, I had to go to the foreign ministry to get a visa renewed in my passport. And the whole foreign ministry, this is in the early 70s, had one manual typewriter, no filing cabinets. Most things are written in longhand, rolled up in scrolls, and put into cubby holes. And they would use a red tape to tie up the records. And this is where the expression red tape comes from, by the way, from the bureaucracy. So it's a very primitive place in that sense. Generally speaking, there's no law and order as we perceive it in the West. Each and every house in the country is a fortress, and each family, clan, and tribe controls the environment to the extent that it has guns and fighters to do so. Revenge is an important part of the system of justice. A crime against one family can be avenged by an attack against any member of the perpetrator's family, so that if you were to kill a man, then that man's family could take revenge not necessarily on you. You probably fled off somewhere, but your uncle, your cousin, it didn't make any difference, but revenge would be taken. And this paradoxically does tend to keep down crime, because you have to think not only what the consequences will be to yourself, but your entire extended family as well. Pashtuns are heavily armed. Tribal Pashtun would no sooner leave the house without his rifle and a few other guns than he would with his pants. It's just an absolute physical part of his body. You see them going through the market in the town, they always have their rifle, and if they were to lift up their shirt, there would be a few more guns stuck in there as well. It amazed me when I was in Kabul back in the early 70s to see men wearing swords. And what amazed me even more was to see some people wearing chainmail shirts. Chainmail. I don't think they wear chainmail anymore, probably. They have better things than that. Infant mortality is about 50%. This explains I think it goes a long way towards explaining the life expectancy of 46 years. But that's kind of skewed, because those people who do live past their infancy are really tough, and they live a long time. They're really tough. What do I mean by that? It's very common, I would see old men and kids walking barefoot in the snow. These people are really physically tough. Income is hard to measure in our context. I've seen per capita figures of $800 per year, but I think that's wildly inflated. I think a closer proximity is about $120 in our terms per year. The average Afghan lives on a diet of bread, which they call naan, and tea. That doesn't mean that bread and tea make up a big part of their diet. I'm saying that makes up their diet. That's what they live on. Several pounds of bread and tea with sugar in it. And believe it or not, you can live on that kind of a diet for a long time. Whole wheat bread. If the family has any extra money, you can take some lamb fat to the baker and ask him to put that in the khamir, the dough, and that gives a little more protein to the bread. Meat and vegetables are a rare and expensive treat in that part of the world. This kind of a diet's really not that unusual. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the Irish, up until the time of the potato famine, used to live on potatoes, several pounds of potatoes per person per day. So it's not our vision of a diet. Personal hygiene items such as soap and toilet paper are unimaginable luxuries never used or seen in the country. Published figures claim an illiteracy rate of 75%. I believe it's more like 95% illiterate, if only because for the last 20 years of fighting and war, most of the schools have been closed. What is surprising to me, or I found very surprising, is that people there can't even count. You think of counting as sort of innate, that you just know how to count. They can't count because they never went to school to learn it. So when they go to the market, they would have a stick with notches on it, and by counting actual lines, they could keep track of their money and change and things like that. So that's how uneducated the people tend to be there. Very few people know their birth date. When I told my students that I knew my birth date, they found that hard to believe. America is a very vague concept, not a country. Very few would have heard of New York, the Pentagon, or the World Trade Towers. Very, very few. Let's get a little bit into the history. Afghanistan has also often been called the crossroads of Central Asia. Marco Polo traveled on his way to China. Ancient Buddhist monks traveled up through here going to China. Here's Bamiyan. This is where that famous Buddha was before the Taliban blew it up. There was a big monastery here. I have some pictures of that. We'll see them later. But being a crossroads, you suffer. We talked about the different armies that have come through and the wars that have occurred. In AD 642, the Arabs invaded this region. But they didn't stay very long. They were displaced by the Persians, then Turkic tribes, then Mongols. And now, in 1747, Ahmad Shah Durrani, a Pashtun, was elected king by a tribal council, which is what the United States and our allies are trying to set up now, another tribal council to maybe elect a new government for the country. But in 1747, a king was set up for the country, a native Afghan. His name was Nader Shah. And from that time up until the communist coup in 1978, all the kings of Afghanistan came from that one tribe. In the 19th century, Afghanistan quickly found itself between the expanding Russian and the British empires. The struggle for influence between these two powers would last more than 100 years, and is commonly known as the Great Game. We could talk all day just on this. British attempts to put a puppet ruler in place led to the first Anglo-Afghan War, resulting in one of the biggest debacles in British military history. And I'm sure you've heard now that they lost an entire army, save for one man, in the fight at that point in time. Let's see if I have a picture of that. This is a famous painting. Any British citizen would recognize it immediately. It's a picture of Dr. Brydon, who was the sole survivor of the British Army in 1842. Well, this horse is just about dead. Its tongue is hanging out, and he's getting to the fortress of Jalalabad, the only man left out of an army of 17,000. Well, this is something that any British person would be familiar with. This was the first of 3 wars between the two nations, none of which proved very satisfactory to the British. As in the first Afghan War, the second saw the British proconsul drawn and quartered with his body parts hung in the public market. So that seems to be the traditional way of starting an Anglo-Afghan war. cut up the British ambassador and hang him up in the marketplace. The last war occurred as late as 1919, when the British actually bombed Kabul from the air. The war ended in an uneasy truce, and gradually the British gave up their attempts to conquer this area. I want to give you a flavor of the history and the politics of this country. I'm going to shoot off a lot of names and dates at you, and it's not necessary to remember these names and dates, but I just want you to listen to the flow, almost like a poem, of what it's like to be a ruler in this part of the world. It's been about 100 years since any Afghan ruler has died peacefully in bed. Now, that's not a hyperbole. Now, I'm just going to give you a little flow here, and just listen for the flow. In 1919, members of an anti-British movement assassinated King Habibullah. His third son and successor, Amanullah, was deposed in 1929. He was followed by a period of instability that saw the bandit Bacha briefly seize power. He was captured and hung by a cousin of Amanullah, Prince Nader Shah, who was later crowned king. He was assassinated 4 years later. He was succeeded by his son Zahir Shah, who was deposed by his uncle Dawood in 1973. Dawood was killed in a bloody communist coup in 1978. Nur Mohammad Taraki, Secretary General of one wing of the Communist Party, became president. He was killed in another coup in 1979. He was succeeded by Hafiz Amin, who had earlier been Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. Meanwhile, resistance to any communist government was growing, and widespread revolt ensued. Faced with a deteriorating situation in a client communist country, the Soviets invaded the country. In December 26, 1979, Soviet forces killed Amin and installed Kamal, a more pliant puppet. He proved to be so unpopular that he was deposed, with Russian support, by Mohammad Najibullah, former chief of the Afghan secret police. In 1992, after the Soviets withdrew, Najibullah and his brother was hung in the town square by anti-communist mujahideen, broadly under the leadership of a guy by the name of Rabbani. After another period of instability, the Taliban seized power in 1996. Rabbani fled into exile. His government has been represented in Afghanistan by Ahmad Shah Massoud, head of the Northern Alliance, United Front against the Taliban. Massoud was recently assassinated, most probably by agents of Osama bin Laden. So you can see that to take on the job of king or ruler of Afghanistan is not something that would make your insurance company very happy. So what can we draw from it? What conclusions can we draw from all this? Well, our forces, now I have to stop and say here that these opinions and conclusions are my own personally and do not reflect the views of MITRE Corporation in any way, shape, or form. Our forces will be able to capture and hold any piece of ground that they wish, but only as long as they physically occupy that space. They can take any ground they want, but only as long as they physically stand on it. The United States can exploit ethnic and tribal divisions. The Northern Alliance is one such group already fighting the Taliban. Most of its fighters are Tajik and Hazaras from the northern part of the country, which means that as that Northern Alliance tries to move further south into the Kabul area, the amount of resistance they're going to come up against is going to increase logarithmically. Right now they're fighting on their own tribal home turf, so to speak, and it's not too bad, but just moving another 30 miles south is going to be one hell of a battle. Now, this is something that you've been hearing more and more about. Given the drought and the lack of resources, over 1 million Afghans will starve to death over the next few months. They won't be hungry, they won't be suffering from famine, they will be dead. The country is so poor, resources are so limited, and the weather is so tough there. In another 2 or 3 weeks, most of the mountain roads will be closed because of the snow. So it'll be impossible to get food into these areas even if we wish to. 1 million tons of food will be needed between now and next May, June. And that assumes that the spring planting will occur, which is not something I would want to bet on. So, an add-on point, if we do manage to bring in this food, don't expect any gratitude. You will not get one person to thank you, and more likely than not, they will bite the hand that feeds them. Their cultural mentality is such that to take the food in the first place is very demeaning. And second of all, altruism is not a quality that they understand very well. They would assume that there's some ulterior motive for the West to supply the food to them. So don't expect any gratitude. Follow-on point to this is that it'll be impossible to win the hearts and minds of the people. Afghanistan does not have a government in the traditional sense. Its current rulers are mullahs. Religion is central to their life. An attack on this government is, by definition, an attack on their religion. Any U.S. puppet or person perceived to be our puppet installed in Kabul will last only as long as U.S. troops are physically there to prop him up. There's a high probability that this person will hang in the marketplace shortly after we leave. I would say that's a very high possibility. Our special forces will be going up against physically tough, battle-hardened fighters defending their homes in an environment in which our forces will find it very difficult to move in surreptitiously. Many times I've traveled through Afghanistan, through mile after mile, hour after hour of godforsaken desert where you wouldn't think a rattlesnake could be alive. And I would stop to eat lunch or to relieve myself, and within a minute my car would be surrounded by people who sort of just sprang out of the ground. It's unbelievable. I don't know where they came from, and I don't know what they were doing there. But I think a part of that is, going back to something I said earlier, is that each house outside of the capital is a fortress, and each family controls land by force of arms, so that all this godforsaken area belongs to somebody, and they're used to, from thousands of years, of defending that territory. So as you travel through their ground, they're watching you all the time, even if you don't see them. So that's finished with my written part of this. We're going to take questions now. What I will do, since we're videotaping this, if you ask a question, I will repeat it for the tape. So.
Bob, before we go to questions, you want to go through your slides?
Okay.
I'm afraid we may get bogged down with the questions.
Okay. I brought some slides with me of the country.
I guess we just need to shut off.
Yeah. They don't map particularly well to the talk that I just gave, but I think they're worth seeing anyway. I'll keep them short, only about 15 or 20, so you shouldn't fall asleep. This is the airport in Kabul, Afghanistan. I show this for two reasons. One, it's an area of interest of ours. This runway, as you can see, is in a valley surrounded by mountains. It's no place where you would want to put an air force of effort. That's number one. And the second point is how barren and desolate this place is. I think one of the reasons it's so barren and desolate is that the people raise sheep and goats, and these animals crop down anything green that pops up immediately. When I was living in Kabul, people would knock on the door of my house, and they would offer to pay me money to cut my grass. They'd offer to pay me money because they would feed the grass to their animals. People would also come to my door, knock, and offer to pay to clean out my outhouse because they would take the night soil and use that on the crops. So it's a very resource-poor environment. Next slide, please.
How old are these pictures?
30 years. But it really hasn't changed that much. In fact, I will say it has changed. I take that back. The scenes you're going to see of Kabul show Kabul under the old king, Zahir Shah, before all the war started. And most of what you're seeing is now reduced to rubble in terms of the buildings. There's very little intact infrastructure. So this was at its best. So what you would see there now probably would just be ruins. There's another picture of the airport and an idea of the mountain. The Kabul is at an altitude of 5,000 feet. Mountains that surround it go up another 5,000 feet. Bamiyan, the center of the country where we talked about the old Buddhists, that's at 11,000 and 12,000 feet on the ground. So think about helicopters working in that environment. When a helicopter's sitting on the ground, it's already at an altitude of 12,000 feet and trying to go with a combat load over the mountains. It's tough. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the national sport of Afghanistan. I can't get over how tough these people are. What this sport is, you have two teams of horsemen. The ball is a 70 or 80-pound dead goat or calf, which is right here. And the object of the game is simply to pick it off the ground and carry it around your opponent's goal line or goal post. So imagine trying to bend down from a horse that's moving and picking up something that weighs about 70 pounds. Next slide, please. And these two guys are fighting over it. You have the audience, so to speak, all around the field, which could be anywhere up to a half-mile long. As the game gets going, people can't see very well, so they tend to move in closer and closer. The horsemen break out of a pack and they start moving in one direction at a gallop. The people and the spectators can't move back, and 20, 30 horses go into the crowd, and somebody always gets killed. Next slide. Here you can see the scrum as they go past. This in the front was the king's reviewing stand. That's why you had these different soldiers, and you had different kinds of soldiers. Policemen, army officers. The king felt that if he had more different kinds of soldiers around him, or he was less chance of assassination, which wasn't a bad idea. Next. And here you can see they're coming right at us at a gallop. Next, please. Each rider carries a whip. They're not allowed to use their whip on the horses, only on their opponents. Next slide. Next slide. And you can see here they're coming right at the royal tent. I'm using a telephoto lens here, so there's a lot of foreshortening. Actually, there's a big ditch in front of that tent, so they're not going to override this particular spot. Next slide. Again, this is a picture after the match, and people are going home, and you can see how dry and barren this countryside is. Just lunar. Next, please. Next. This is a typical Afghan store. The economy doesn't rise much higher than this. Pots and pans, probably made locally. Next, please. This is a jeweler. He's got a blowpipe in his mouth, and he's blowing on a little crucible here to heat up the metal to make jewelry, silver jewelry. Next. Typical Afghan tourist wears. I don't think any Afghans would wear that kind of colorful stuff, but at that time they had a nascent tourist industry. That's all gone. Next, please. Typical little jewelry store. A lot of the jewelry is not silver. It's made out of pot metal, but next. This is the village of Shewa. It's on the southern part of the country, very near the Pakistani border. This town, on the outside of this town, there's a beautiful, or there was, a beautiful Greek temple, the remains of a beautiful Greek temple. And if you go out to those ruins, you could see the beautifully incised and carved Greek statuary around the base of the temple. Just beautiful. And then you come to this place, and it's so squalid, so mean and nasty that you can see that culture and history does not follow some kind of linear progression. The things don't necessarily get better over time. Next, please. This man is got a lathe. By using this bow back and forth, he's turning the wood to make the wooden objects to create these. And what struck me is that these wooden pots look very much like Buddha stupas. This was a Greek area. You had the Greeks were followed by the Buddhists, and the stupas look like that. And I wonder, although there are no stupas left, I wonder if that isn't some kind of cultural artifact from something that these people aren't even aware of. Next slide. This is the city of Ghazni in the southern part of the country. It was a big, powerful country, kingdom until the Mughal horde, Genghis Khan, came through here. He destroyed it, and this is the only thing left of the city, of the old city. Next slide. There's a picture of Ghazni. This is a typical mid-sized city in Afghanistan. Those walls are 75, 100 feet high, but they're made of mud. They're not made of brick or stone or anything like that. That's a fortress still used by the Army. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the center of the city of Kabul. This is one of the older mosques. This mosque in particular is interesting because it was damaged by the British when they bombed the place back in 1919. Next slide. This is a wealthy area of Kabul where I lived as a Peace Corps volunteer. All this area now has been destroyed, but the climate there is quite nice. You're at 5,000 feet. It's like Denver. The air is crisp and clean. Not too much disease, at least in the air. The water is filthy, but not a bad place to live. Next slide. This is just another picture of the wealthier part of Kabul, which I'm told now is all gone. Next, please. This is Balahasar Fortress. It's in the very center of the city. It dominates the city, still used by the Army. There is a cannon on the fort that fires every day at noontime, and that's how people tell time, the noon gun. Next slide, please. Another picture of Kabul. All the houses that you see here are made out of mud brick with flat roofs. If it rains too much, then the roofs start to leak mud, so you have to keep remudding your roof every year or two. Next slide. In none of my pictures will you see women. This is a chador, covers head to foot, makes it very difficult to see, and people are always falling down because I can't see the potholes, I can't see the curb, but that's what they have to wear when they go out of the house. Next slide, please. This is my house here. We had a maid, which is very unusual in Afghanistan, but she was a Hazara, one of the Mughal-type people from the center part of the country. They would take the very menial jobs in the country that not even an Afghan would take, which is really saying something. And she's supervising the unloading of firewood. And it's kind of sad. Firewood's very expensive because, you can imagine, there's no trees. So what you see here, and you really can't tell, is that anything that's green gets rooted up, including the roots, so that between the goats and the sheep and the people who need something to keep warm in, green things don't have much of a chance in that society. Next slide, please. This is a orchard, a vineyard. The grapes are used for raisins. Afghan raisins are pretty good. No wine in the country, of course. It's one of the staples. Next slide. This is a city that was destroyed by Genghis Khan. It's called Sherda-Gogola. What amazed me going through the country, I didn't tell you that the reason I went to Afghanistan is that I was in the South Asian program at the University of Pennsylvania. And I had been studying that region. I wanted to go there to learn the language. Anyway, what amazes me is none of the archaeological sites have been excavated in any way, shape, or form. There's been no stability there for the last couple hundred years, so it's been impossible for archaeologists to go in there. It's just absolutely full of very interesting sites that have not been explored in any way, shape, or form. Next slide, please. There's another view of the city. Next slide. Can you go back one? You can tell this is a very old city simply by the height. As these old sites throughout the Middle East were destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt, they form an artificial mountain over time. And this would represent a couple thousand years to get up to that height. Next slide, please. And then the next one. This is the archetypical successful Afghan. He's a Tajik from the northern part of the country. He's a rich man in their culture. He owns one of the teams of Bushkashi horses like a rich person in Argentina or the United States would own a polo team. The little boy with him is his son. He's very proud of this boy because he's an old man and he's got 4 wives, and that's just his latest child. So he's a happy camper. Next slide. All these men are his sons. They comprise the team. So in his culture, that's the epitome of success. Next slide, please. This is the road north going through the Salang Pass, way, way up. Now you're getting some serious mountains up here. As I said, the Russians did a wonderful job when they built that road. People wondered why they built that road, but I guess we found out why. We go next slide. This is myself on a typical Afghan taxi, which is a horse-drawn or sleigh-drawn cart. I was visiting an old archaeological site somewhere in the center of the country. Next slide, please. That's me. In the Salang Pass. Next slide, please. These Afghans are breaking rock salt. That's the only salt they would get. They'd smash it and then they'd sell it out in the countryside. Next slide. This is a picture of Istalif. Green trees, very pretty, very unusual for the country. Next slide, please. This is Bamiyan. This is where that Buddha is. It's a nice, beautiful valley, green, fertile. You can understand why they would put a monastery in this area. Now, the problem is these green areas are small and widely spread in certain valleys where they've been dammed up. And this is where the area has been heavily mined. There are 10 million unaccounted for mines in Afghanistan. And this is exactly the kind of area where they would be placed to prevent the farmers from growing a crop. And this is one of the reasons why they have this terrible drought there, famine. Next slide. You can see this is the wheat crop, the scarecrow. And where there's water, there's green, and when there's not, there's not. But you can see this is all erosion. At one time, these hills were probably all covered with forests and trees, and they've all been, because of poor land management over the centuries, just completely denuded. Next slide. There's the Buddha. It's very difficult for you, again, I'm using a telephoto lens, to see how really big this statue was. You can barely see an opening right here at the base. That's big enough for a tractor-trailer truck to drive through. It is possible to go up through the caves where the monks would live, all the way up through and stand on top of the Buddha's head. Next slide, please. This is one of the smaller Buddhas along the side of the big one, and some of the caves, some of the fronts of the caves have fallen down and collapsed, but these are little cubicles where the monks would live. Next slide. I'm now standing, when I took this picture, on the Buddha's head. You can see the curve of the arc that sheltered the Buddha, overlooking the valley. Monastery was probably down here somewhere. That arc that surrounded the Buddha's head was covered with beautiful paintings that had been done 2,000 years ago. Next slide, please. Because they were so high and so inaccessible, the Islamic people over the centuries couldn't reach them to destroy them. So they shot at them, and these are just bullet holes at the pictures that they couldn't reach. Next. It was just wonderful art, and it's all gone now. Next slide, please. This is the area around Bamiyan. This is at 12,000 feet. I went there with a group of other volunteers. It's funny, at that altitude, when you're smoking a cigarette, the cigarette burns a funny yellow color. It's really hard to breathe. So you can imagine any kind of military activity up in this kind of a climate. It's not going to be easy. Next slide. Again, just a picture to give you an idea of what the terrain is like. Next. And These are a series of lakes up in the northern part of the country. Even with all that water, there's hardly any green around them. Next. This is a typical Afghan bus. They've stopped to pray on the side of the road. People pray 5 times a day. If you travel on the roof of the bus, it's half price. And if you travel on the bus clinging to the side, it's a third of the price. The next slide. This is Mazar-e-Sharif. This is one of the major cities in the northern part of the country, near the Russian border. I don't know if this mosque has survived or not. I hope it has, because it's very old and very beautiful. Next. This is a typical Afghan carpet. When you see this deep red with black, these are called elephant footprint pattern. That's Afghan. Can only be Afghan. Next. Typical Afghan rug merchant. Next, please. And another typical Afghan store. I think that's the last one. Yep. This man is making, I'm trying to think of the proper word. I think it's flenging. He's taking the flesh off of a sheepskin, so they can use that to make a coat with. They really didn't have the chemicals and the know-how to properly cure and preserve leather like we would do. They make the pristine coats, the nice suede coats with the fur on the inside, but they smell. Whew. I had one when I was there. We wore it for 2 years. When I brought it back to the United States, my wife made me throw it away because she said I was bothering everybody with the way it stank. Didn't notice it over there. Next slide, please. Typical Afghan means of transportation. Next. This is a chai-hana, a tea house. These are Pashtun tribesmen having their tea. The only thing you get in a restaurant like that would be kebab and tea, and very often they would simply drink the tea right out of the spout without a cup. This must be an elegant restaurant. Next slide. And that's it. Now I'll take questions. Yes?
What people and part of the country would Osama bin Laden feel comfortable among? Wouldn't you feel comfortable being sheltered by?
He's comfortable amongst the Taliban, who are the Pashtun tribes in the south and western part of the country, extending into the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. Next question.
Could you throw some light on women's life there and how the marriages are arranged?
Yes. The question was, could I throw some light on the role or the life of women in this culture? And the life is very, very poor and short. When a woman in Afghanistan is 25, she looks about 65. They have babies one after another. Marriage usually occurs at age 14. There is no love between a husband and a wife. That's just an alien concept. A true affection is between men. And there's a lot of homosexuality in the country. But women are there for breeding purposes and taking care of the house, and that's just about it. It's not a very good life. There's a famous story about this Afghan man who thought his wife was being unfaithful, so he cut off her nose as punishment. And then later he found out that she had not been unfaithful to him, so he felt a little bit guilty. So he went to a foreign doctor and asked if the doctor could, fix it. And the doctor said yes, it would cost about 2,000 Afghanis to do the operation. He said, oh, forget it. For that money, I could buy a new wife cheaper. So, I mean, that's just a story, but it conveys the attitude there towards women. Not good. Yes, sir?
Opium production, has the drought affected that?
The question was, how about opium production? You raise another interesting question that I was asked at the last session. They asked, what is Afghanistan's biggest cash export? And that is opium. And who's the biggest customer? The United States. It's a $1 billion business. It has been affected by the drought, but opium is something that they have been stockpiling for a number of years as the Taliban has cut back on the day-to-day production. There's a huge amount of opium in the country. It's probably the world's biggest producer of opium, and I can imagine now, given a lack of other resources, that they will push that crop. They will push it as much as they can.
Is any of that legally exported?
The question was, is any of the opium illegally exported? No, it is not. I don't think it ever has been. First of all, we've had some kind of embargo against Afghanistan now for a couple years. And even before that, I think most of it was illegally exported, mostly through Iran, but also northward through the former Soviet republics. Sir?
What was your role there in the Peace Corps and how that worked with the feelings against altruism?
People there, okay. What was my role in Afghanistan with the Peace Corps, and how did people perceive me? Well, oftentimes people who had a little bit of education would say, well, you really work for the CIA, don't you? I mean, really, yes, I'm here to report on the price of naan in the marketplace, you know. But there's a dichotomy here, and it's very important that I should tell you this, and thank you for reminding me.